The bullet hole in the cabin door had been there so long that snow collected in its edges like a frozen tear. 7 winters Daniel McKenna had stared at that hole, remembering the day he'd put it there himself in a rage that nearly killed him, along with everything else. The Colorado high country didn't forgive mistakes, and Daniel had made the worst kind, surviving when better men didn't. Wind hammered the ridge that December morning, carrying with it the scent of storm and something else. Something that made the bay gelding in his makeshift corral pace and snort at shadows. Daniel stood at the window, coffee growing cold in his fist, watching the tree line blur through sheets of driving snow. In 7 years of hiding from civilization, he learned to read the mountain's moods like scripture. Today felt different. Today felt like judgment coming dressed as weather. The pewter watch in his vest pocket ticked steadily, Sarah's last gift, before she'd taken little Emma to town for supplies while he stayed behind to mend fence. The mine collapse hadn't been his fault, the territorial marshal had assured him. Just bad luck and worse timing. But guilt didn't listen to marshals, and Daniel had carried that watch like a stone in his chest, ever since marking time he didn't deserve to have. Through the storm movement caught his eye. Not the familiar lurch of elk or the ghostly drift of snow devils, but something deliberate, human. Daniel set his cup on the scarred pine table and reached for the Winchester hanging above the door muscle memory from War and Worse, making his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. 2 figures emerged from the white curtain of snow like spirits taking flesh. An older woman bent nearly double against the wind, supported by someone younger. They stumbled toward his porch with the desperation of drowning swimmers reaching for driftwood. The older woman's legs gave out 20 yards from his door, and she collapsed into the drift, her companion dropping beside her. Through the howling wind, Daniel heard something that stopped his blood cold. A woman's voice calling out in English, clear enough to carry, "Please, if there's anyone there, my mother is dying." He should have stayed inside. 7 years of bitter solitude had taught him that helping strangers led to complications, and complications led to the kind of pain that hollowed a man from the inside out. But something about that voice, desperate yet dignified, reminded him of Sarah calling his name across their first homestead, brave and foolish and trusting that the world might actually give them what they dared to want. Daniel grabbed his coat and stepped into the storm. The older woman was Apache, her weathered face gray with exhaustion and cold. Frost clung to her iron-gray braids, and each breath rattled in her chest like dice in a cup. The younger woman kneeling beside her was perhaps 20, with the kind of striking features that made men start wars and women pray for plain daughters. Her dark eyes met Daniel's through the snow, and he saw intelligence there, and wariness, and a pride that even dying in a blizzard couldn't quite break. "She can't walk anymore," the young woman said, having to shout over the wind. "We've been traveling for 3 days. Please." Daniel knelt beside them, noting details that might matter, the older woman's fine beadwork on her winter coat suggesting status. The younger woman's hands calloused from work, but soft enough to indicate she'd never known true hunger. The absence of men, which in Apache culture meant either exile or tragedy. "Can you help me carry her?" Daniel asked. The young woman nodded, slipping her arms under her mother's shoulders while Daniel took her legs. Together they fought through the storm to his porch, snow stinging their faces like thrown sand. Inside, the cabin's warmth hit them like a physical blow, and the older woman's eyes fluttered open for the first time since they'd arrived. "Nadua," she whispered to her daughter, the Apache word carrying layers of meaning Daniel couldn't parse. Then fixing her dark eyes on Daniel, "You are the hermit who lives with ghosts." Daniel felt something cold that had nothing to do with winter settle in his stomach. "How did you know?" "Word travels even to exile." The older woman's English was precise, educated. "They say you lost family in the mine. They say you came here to die slowly instead of quickly." "Mother," the younger woman warned softly, "truth doesn't soften with courtesy, Aiyana." The older woman struggled to sit up straighter. "I am Sisika of the Wind River people. This is my daughter, Aiyana. We have been cast out from our tribe." Daniel helped Sisika to the chair by his fire, noting how light she felt, how her breathing seemed to catch and skip like a stone on water. "Cast out for what?" Aiyana moved to warm her hands at the fire, and Daniel caught the scent of sage and pine needles in her hair. "For refusing to let me marry a man 3 times my age who beat his first 2 wives to death." The simple statement hung in the air like smoke. Daniel busied himself ladling stew from the pot that had been simmering since morning, giving his hands something to do while his mind worked. In his experience, Apache women didn't speak so directly to white men unless desperation had stripped away every other option. "You have nowhere else to go," he said. It wasn't a question. "We hope to reach the mission at Bent's Fort," Sasika said, accepting the bowl Daniel offered. "But winter came early and I am—" She gestured vaguely at her chest where a wet cough had settled like a living thing. "That's a hard ride in good weather," Daniel said. "In this storm on foot, it's suicide." "Yes," Aiyana said simply. "We know." Something in her tone made Daniel look up from the fire he was stoking. She wasn't asking for rescue or making promises she couldn't keep. She was simply stating facts the way a person might mention that water was wet or fire was hot. They were going to die and they knew it, but they'd keep walking toward Bent's Fort anyway, because the alternative was giving up. "You can stay here until the storm passes," Daniel heard himself say. Sisika studied his face in the firelight. And after the storm, Daniel looked out the window at the white fury beyond, thinking of the pewter watch in his vest and the bullet hole in his door, and 7 years of careful numbness that had kept him breathing when breathing felt like betrayal. "We'll see what's left standing when it's over." That night, after Sisika had fallen into an exhausted sleep on Daniel's cot, and Aiyana had curled up in blankets by the fire, Daniel sat at his table cleaning the Winchester he hadn't needed to use. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside his cabin felt different, smaller and larger, at the same time filled with the soft breathing of people who trusted him enough to sleep in his presence. He pulled out the pewter watch and let it lie open in his palm. Sarah's inscription, still clear after all these years: "Time stops for no one, but love makes every moment count." For 7 years, he'd been trying to make time stop, to hold himself in the moment, before loss, before the mind collapse, before the world taught him that wanting things was just another way of setting yourself up for heartbreak. Now, listening to the quiet breathing of two women who'd walked into a blizzard, rather than surrender their dignity, Daniel wondered if maybe time wasn't supposed to stop. Maybe it was supposed to keep moving, carrying you forward into whatever came next, whether you were ready for it or not. The storm would break eventually. When it did, decisions would need to be made. But for now, it was enough that his cabin held 3 heartbeats instead of 1, and that for the first time in 7 years, Daniel McKenna was planning beyond tomorrow. The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving the world wrapped in silence so complete it felt like stepping inside a church. Daniel stood on his porch in the gray dawn light, breathing air so sharp it cut like glass, watching the sun struggle through clouds heavy with the promise of more snow. The trail down to the valley was buried under drifts that would take days to become passable, and even then only for someone who knew the mountain's moods. Inside, Aiyana moved through his cabin with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to making do. She'd taken over the cooking without asking, and Daniel had to admit that venison stew had never tasted quite so good as when she prepared it with wild herbs she'd somehow foraged from beneath the snow. Sisika remained weak, her cough worse in the mornings, but her mind stayed sharp as winter wind. "You were a soldier," she observed while Daniel split firewood near the hearth. It wasn't a question. "Oh, what makes you say that?" "Sure. The way you sleep, always facing the door. The way you check your rifle twice before setting it down. The scars on your hands." Sisika's dark eyes missed nothing. "Apache territory, among other places." Daniel set another log on the fire, not meeting her gaze. "Long time ago. Not so long that you've forgotten how to kill." Aiyana looked up from the cornbread she was mixing flour, dusting her fingers. "Mother, that's enough." "Is it?" Sisika's voice carried the authority of a woman who'd spent decades reading the true nature of men. "Your daughter is beautiful, Daniel McKenna. Beautiful enough that men have died for her. Beautiful enough that they'll die for her again if they find her here." The mixing bowl slipped in Aiyana's hands and Daniel reached out instinctively to steady it, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with winter cold and everything to do with the warmth of her skin, the way her breath caught when he touched her. "I'm not looking for trouble," Daniel said, stepping back. "Trouble doesn't care what you're looking for." Sisika began braiding her gray hair with practiced motions. "3 young men from our tribe have already started north following our trail. They believe Aiyana belongs to them. She belongs to herself." The words came out harder than Daniel intended, and both women stared at him. Aiyana's expression was unreadable, but something flickered in her dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper? Yes, Sisika said softly. She does. The question is whether you're prepared to help her stay that way. That afternoon, while Sisika slept, Daniel and Aiyana worked together to clear snow from around the cabin. The physical labor felt good after days of confinement, and Daniel found himself stealing glances at the way she moved, economical but graceful, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air. She'd braided her long black hair back, but strands had escaped to frame her face, and more than once Daniel had to force himself to focus on his shovel rather than the curve of her cheek. Tell me about your wife, Aiyana said suddenly. Daniel's shovel bit into the snow harder than necessary. What do you want to know? Was she beautiful? Yuan. The question caught him off guard. Yes, but that wasn't what mattered about her. Waim. What did matter? Daniel paused, remembering Sarah's laugh, the way she'd hum while tending their small garden, how she'd fall asleep reading to Emma by lamplight. She made everything feel possible, like the world was bigger and brighter than I'd thought. And your daughter, she was sunshine, always asking questions, always finding wonder in things I'd stopped noticing. Daniel's voice roughened. She would have been 12 next month. Aiyana stopped shoveling and looked at him directly. You blame yourself. I should have been there. Town. Meeting with the territorial commissioner about safety concerns in the mine. Ironic, right? Daniel's laugh held no humor. I was trying to make the mine safer when the whole thing came down. So you were doing your job. I was doing what I thought was important instead of being where I was needed. Aiyana leaned on her shovel, studying his face. My first suitor was named Takanha. Sweet boy, barely 18. He challenged an older warrior for my hand and was killed for his trouble. The second was Nalnish, who tried to steal me during a trading ceremony and started a fight that left 4 men dead. She resumed, shoveling, her voice matter-of-fact. I learned early that beauty can be a curse, that wanting something or someone can destroy everything around it. That's not the same thing. Isn't it you think you're responsible for deaths that happen because of forces beyond your control? I think I'm responsible for deaths that happened because men couldn't control themselves around me. She met his eyes. Maybe we're both wrong. Maybe bad things just happen, and survival means learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you. That evening, Sisika called Daniel to her bedside. Her breathing had grown more labored throughout the day, and her skin carried the waxy pallor of someone fighting a losing battle. I won't see another week, she said without preamble. The storm's cleared. I can take you to a doctor and... No. Sisika's voice was gentle but firm. My body knows its limits, and I've accepted them. But Aiyana, she gripped his hand with surprising strength. She's strong, but she's been running so long she's forgotten how to stand still. She needs someone who won't ask her to be less than she is. I'm not looking for a wife. Neither was she looking for a husband when her tribe tried to force one on her. Sometimes what we need and what we want are different things. Sisika's eyes grew distant. I had a vision 3 nights ago. Snow falling on a cabin, but inside there was warmth, a child's laughter. Aiyana's voice singing old songs to new ears. She focused on Daniel again. Don't let fear make you waste what the mountain spirits are offering. I lost everything once. You can't live without risk, Daniel McKenna. You can only choose whether that risk is worth taking. Outside wind began to pick up again, and Daniel felt the familiar knot of anxiety in his chest that came with the approach of another storm. But for the first time in 7 years, the anxiety was mixed with something else, the recognition that he wasn't facing the weather alone. Later that night, as Aiyana tended the fire and Daniel cleaned his rifle by lamplight, she spoke quietly. If those men from my tribe come here, will you fight them? Daniel looked up from the weapon in his hand, seeing his own reflection in the dark window beyond her. If they try to take you against your will, yes. And if I chose to go with them, the question hit him like a physical blow. That's your decision to make, but not one you'd support. Daniel set down the rifle and met her gaze directly. No, not one I'd support. Aiyana smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the storm brought them to his door. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. The wind howled louder outside, but inside the cabin something had shifted. 3 people had become something more than strangers sharing shelter. They'd become something that might survive whatever was coming down the mountain toward them. Sisika died in her sleep on the 6th night so quietly that Daniel only knew because Aiyana's soft keening woke him just before dawn. She knelt beside the cot holding her mother's cold hand, tears streaming down her face, but no sound except that low primal mourning that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. Daniel dressed quickly and went to her. Without speaking, he gathered Sisika's slight form in his arms. She weighed no more than kindling and carried her to the small root cellar where the ground stayed soft enough for burial once spring came. Aiyana followed, wrapping her mother's face in the ceremonial shawl she'd carried from their homeland. "The ground's too frozen," Daniel said gently. "I know Apache burial traditions. She'll wait." Aiyana's voice was steady now. Grief crystallized into something harder. She always said patience was the greatest virtue. They returned to the cabin in silence, but something fundamental had shifted. Sisika had been their bridge, the reason Daniel could justify sheltering them without examining his deeper motives. Now there was just him and Aiyana, and the electricity that sparked between them every time their eyes met. Daniel was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the horses. 3 riders picked their way carefully down the slope, following the depression where their original trail lay buried under snow. Even at a distance, he could see they rode Apache ponies and carried themselves with the easy confidence of men who'd never doubted their right to take what they wanted. He set down his axe and walked quickly to the cabin. Aiyana stood at the window, her face pale but resolute. "How long?" Daniel asked. "Minutes, maybe less." She turned to him and he saw fear there, but also determination. "Their leader is Nalnish, the one I told you about who started the trading post fight. He's convinced himself that I belong to him, and the others, his brothers. They follow where he leads." Aiyana's hands trembled slightly as she moved away from the window. "Daniel, you don't understand what you're facing. Nalnish isn't just arrogant, he's twisted. He enjoys breaking things, people especially." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew closer. Daniel checked his rifle, then the Colt at his hip habits from darker days that his hands remembered, even when his mind preferred to forget. "There's a back way out through the root cellar," he said. "You could—" "No." Aiyana's voice cut through his words like a blade. "I'm done running." The rider stopped 20 yards from his porch, close enough to talk, far enough to charge if talking failed. Nalnish dismounted first, a lean man with angular features and cold eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. His brothers remained mounted, hands resting casually near their weapons. "You have something that belongs to me," Nalnish called out in accented English. Daniel stepped onto his porch rifle, held loose but ready. "Don't see anything here that belongs to you. The woman, Aiyana, she was promised to me before her mother poisoned her mind with white man's ideas. From what I hear, she refused you herself." Nalnish's laugh held no warmth. "Women refuse many things until they learn better. Open your door, white man. Let her choose again, now that she's seen how winter treats runaways. She's free to choose, always has been. Then let her speak for herself." Daniel felt Aiyana move behind him, stepping onto the porch, despite his silent gesture for her to stay inside. She'd changed from her traveling dress into one of Sarah's old gowns, a deep blue wool that brought out the darkness of her hair and made her look like something from a dream or a painting. "Hello, Nalnish," she said calmly. "I see exile hasn't improved your manners." "Exile?" Nalnish's smile turned sharp. "Is that what your mother told you? We weren't exiled, beautiful one. We left to bring you home." The words hit Aiyana like a physical blow. Daniel saw her flinch, saw the careful composure crack just slightly. "That's impossible. The tribal council reconsidered once they realized what your absence meant. A beautiful woman attracts allies, trading partners, political advantages. Your mother lied to keep you from your destiny." Daniel watched Aiyana's face cycle through shock, hurt, and finally a cold rage that transformed her features into something fierce and beautiful and terrible. "My destiny or your ambition? Sometimes they're the same thing." Nalnish took a step closer. "Come with me now and we'll forget this foolishness. Stay with this broken white man, and I'll take you anyway, but you won't enjoy the journey home." "She's not going anywhere. She doesn't want to go." Daniel's voice carried the flat certainty of a man who'd killed before, and would again if necessary. Nalnish studied him with new interest, noting the way he held the rifle. The scars on his hands, the stillness that marked dangerous men. "You'd fight 3 Apache warriors for a woman who isn't even your wife. I'd fight an army for someone under my protection." "Protection?" Nalnish savored the word. "Tell me, white man, where was your protection when your real family died? Where was your strength when you could have saved them?" The words found their mark. Daniel felt the familiar stab of guilt, the weight of failure that lived in his chest like a second heart. But before the old paralysis could take hold, Aiyana stepped forward. Enough! Her voice carried absolute authority. You want to know my choice, I choose him. Not because he's white or broken or safe, but because he's honorable. Because he's never tried to own me or break me or force me to be less than I am. She moved to Daniel's side close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. And if you try to take me from this place, you'll have to kill us both. Nalnish's face darkened. So be it. The fight erupted without warning. Nalnish lunged forward while his brothers spurred their horses toward the porch. Daniel's rifle spoke first, taking one brother from his saddle with a shot that echoed off the surrounding peaks. He was working the bolt when Nalnish reached him, a war club appearing in his hand, as if conjured from air. The club whistled past Daniel's head close enough to part his hair. He reversed the rifle, using the stock to block the next swing, then drove the barrel into Nalnish's ribs. The Apache warrior stumbled, but recovered quickly, his own knife flashing silver in the winter light. Behind him, Daniel heard Aiyana scream, not in fear, but in rage. The second brother had dismounted and was advancing on her with a length of rope. She met his charge with Sarah's cast-iron skillet, swinging it with enough force to drop him to his knees. Daniel and Nalnish circled each other in the snow, both bleeding from minor cuts, both breathing hard in the thin mountain air. The Apache was younger, faster, but Daniel had learned to fight in places where mistakes meant death. She'll never love you, Nalnish panted. Not really. You're just the safe choice, the white man's guilt she can hide behind. Maybe. Daniel feinted left, then drove his shoulder into Nalnish's chest, sending them both tumbling into the snow. But that's her decision to make. They rolled, grappling for advantage. Nalnish's knife scored Daniel's shoulder, drawing blood that steamed in the cold air. Daniel got his hands around the warrior's throat, squeezing, until Nalnish's eyes bulged and his face began to darken. Daniel stepped on. Aiyana's voice cut through the red haze of combat. Daniel looked up to see her standing over them, Nalnish's own rifle pointed at his chest. Let him go, she said quietly. This ends now. Daniel released his grip, rolling away as Nalnish gasped and choked in the bloody snow. The remaining brother, the one Aiyana had clubbed, sat dazed against a tree, no longer a threat. You have your answer, Aiyana said to Nalnish. Take your brother and leave. Don't come back. Nalnish struggled to his feet, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Aiyana's voice carried finality. I'm dead to you now. Dead to all of you. Find another woman to obsess over. They watched the two surviving Apache warriors ride away, supporting their dead brother across one of the horses. When they disappeared over the ridge, Daniel and Aiyana stood in the sudden silence, breathing hard and trembling with adrenaline. Your shoulder, Aiyana said, noticing the blood soaking through his shirt. It's nothing serious. Daniel looked at her, seeing her clearly, for perhaps the first time, not as a beautiful woman who'd brought him complications, but as a partner who'd stood beside him when violence came calling. You saved my life. You saved mine first. She stepped closer, her hand gentle on his wounded shoulder. Daniel, what Nalnish said about my mother lying doesn't matter. She did what she thought was best to protect you. But it means we could have found another way. Maybe if we'd gone to another tribe, or maybe, Daniel covered her hand with his. But then I never would have met you. The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning dangerous water. Aiyana's eyes searched his face, looking for certainty, for promise, for something solid to build on. What are we doing here, Daniel? I don't know, but I know I don't want you to leave. And I know I don't want to go. They kissed in the bloody snow beside his cabin, tasting copper and desperation, and something that might have been hope. When they broke apart, both were crying for Sisika, for the past they couldn't change, for the future they were afraid to want. But mostly they cried, because for the first time since arriving on his mountain, neither of them was alone. Spring came early that year, arriving like a whispered promise in late February, when the snow began to soften at midday, and the creek behind Daniel's cabin started speaking again in tongues of rushing water. With the thaw came possibilities and dangers that winter had held at bay. Daniel stood in his doorway, watching Aiyana tend the small garden plot they'd cleared together near the south wall of the cabin. She moved with careful precision, her hands dark with soil, her hair braided back and gleaming in the morning sun. 3 months had passed since the fight with Nalnish, 3 months of learning to live together in the intimate space of his cabin, of sharing meals and stories, and the kind of quiet companionship that felt like peace. But peace was a luxury the mountain rarely allowed for long. The first sign of trouble came with Jake Morrison, an old prospector who stopped by Daniel's cabin every few months to trade news for coffee and a hot meal. This time Jake's weathered face carried worry lines deeper than usual. "Heard some talk down in Silverton," Jake said, accepting the cup Aiyana handed him with a grateful nod. "Seems word's gotten around about you having an Apache woman up here. Some folks are getting ideas." Daniel felt ice settle in his stomach. What kind of ideas? The territorial kind. Government's been looking for excuses to relocate more tribes, and having renegade Apache this far north gives them ammunition. Jake sipped his coffee, his eyes serious. "There's a new Indian agent named Crawford, fresh from Washington. He's ambitious, wants to make a name for himself cleaning up irregular situations. Aiyana's not a renegade. She's not part of any tribe anymore. Don't matter what's true. Matters what Crawford can make people believe." Jake glanced at Aiyana, who continued her gardening, but Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders. "Word is he's planning to ride up here with a federal marshal and some territorial militia. Official business, he calls it." Daniel's hand moved instinctively to the Colt at his hip. "When? Soon as the mountain passes clear enough for horses. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe less if this warm spell holds." That evening, Daniel and Aiyana sat by the fire, the weight of unspoken decisions hanging between them, like smoke. Outside, the wind carried the sound of melting snow and the distant cry of eagles returning to nest in the high peaks. "You could leave," Daniel said finally. "Head west to California or south to Mexico. Start over where no one knows your history. With what money, what prospects?" Aiyana poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "I'm a woman alone with no family, no tribe, no connections. How long do you think I'd survive?" "Yeek, Governor. You're stronger than you know. Strength without resources is just another way to die slowly." She set down the poker and looked at him directly. "Besides, leaving means abandoning the first place I've ever felt like I belonged." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "This isn't your fight." "Isn't it? They're coming for me, Daniel. Using me as an excuse to advance their careers to show how tough they are on Indian problems. If I run, they'll just find another Apache woman to persecute, another family to destroy. If you stay, they might kill you. And if I go, they might kill you for harboring a fugitive." Aiyana moved closer to him on the wooden bench they shared. "Either way, people suffer. At least this way we suffer together." 3 days later, the sound Daniel had been dreading echoed across the valley, horses moving fast, too many of them for a social visit. He counted 8 riders cresting the ridge, led by a thin man in a black coat who sat his horse like he owned everything the sun touched. Crawford, Daniel thought, recognizing the type even at a distance. The kind of federal appointee who saw the frontier as a place to build reputation on other people's misery. "Federal Marshal Davis," Crawford announced when they reached Daniel's cabin, though he made no move to dismount. "You're Daniel McKenna." "I am. We're here on official business regarding the harboring of a fugitive Apache woman known to be living on these premises." Daniel stepped fully onto his porch, noting how the territorial militiamen spread out to flank the cabin, while keeping their rifles visible but not quite threatening. Yet. "No fugitives here," Daniel said evenly. "Just my wife and me." Crawford's eyebrows rose. "Your wife? How interesting. I don't suppose you have documentation of this marriage." "Mountain marriages don't require federal paperwork." "Perhaps not, but harboring Apache renegades requires federal investigation." Crawford finally dismounted, his movements precise and aggressive. "By order of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I'm authorized to detain any Apache individuals found living outside designated reservation boundaries." "She's not living outside anything. She's living in her own home." "Her home?" Crawford smiled coldly. "Apache have no property rights under territorial law. Any land claims she might make are automatically invalid." Daniel felt the familiar weight of the Colt at his hip, but 8 armed men made those odds impossible. Behind him, he sensed Aiyana moving closer to the door, and he hoped she had the sense to slip out the back and run for the tree line. "Let me see this supposed wife of yours," Crawford continued. "Let her speak for herself. I can speak for myself." Aiyana stepped onto the porch and Daniel's heart sank. She dressed in her finest clothing, the blue wool dress that had been Sarah's, her hair elaborately braided with small silver ornaments Sisika had left her. She looked beautiful and dignified and utterly vulnerable, surrounded by armed men who saw her as less than human. "So you claim to be Mrs. McKenna?" Crawford studied her with the cold attention of a man cataloging livestock. "I am Aiyana McKenna," she replied steadily. "This is my home and this is my husband." "Convenient. Tell me, Mrs. McKenna, what was your maiden name?" Daniel saw the trap instantly. Any Apache name would undermine her claim to citizenship and marriage rights. Any white name would be obviously false. "Aiyana Windwalker," she said without hesitation. "Of the Wind River people." "Wind River. That's the reservation in Wyoming territory." Crawford's smile grew sharper. "Which means you're supposed to be there, not here playing house with a white hermit." "I was cast out from my tribe. I have no claim to reservation land." "Cast out for what crimes?" Aiyana's jaw tightened. "For refusing to submit to an arranged marriage." "Ah, so you admit to violating tribal authority. That makes you a renegade by definition." Crawford gestured to his men. "Sergeant Willis placed this woman under arrest for violation of federal Indian policy." "No." The word came from Daniel, flat and final. He stepped between Crawford and Aiyana, his hand resting openly on his gun butt. "Mr. McKenna," Crawford said smoothly, "I strongly advise against interfering with federal law enforcement. This is my land. She's my wife. You have no authority here. On the contrary, I have the authority of the United States government." Crawford nodded to his men, who began moving closer, rifles no longer casual, but ready. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities, all of them ending in blood. 8-2, assuming Aiyana could fight, which was asking a lot. The cabin offered some cover, but they'd be trapped inside with no escape route except the root cellar that opened behind the building. "There's another option." The voice came from the tree line, and Daniel's blood froze as Jake Morrison stepped into view. But Jake wasn't alone. Behind him came a man Daniel recognized but had hoped never to see again, Colonel William Hayes, his former commanding officer from the Apache campaigns. "Colonel Hayes," Crawford said, clearly surprised, "what brings you to this remote location?" Hayes rode closer, his weathered face unreadable. "Heard you were planning to arrest one of my scouts." "Your scouts?" Aiyana Windwalker served as a translator and cultural liaison during the Geronimo campaign. Her work saved lives, white lives, on more than one occasion. Hayes dismounted slowly, his movements casual, but his eyes alert. "She has official recognition as a civilian contractor with the United States Army." Crawford's confidence wavered slightly. "I was not informed of any such status." "No reason you would be. Military intelligence operations aren't generally shared with Indian Affairs bureaucrats." Hayes pulled a folded document from his coat. "This is her certificate of service, signed by General Crook himself. According to federal law, civilian contractors who serve with distinction in Apache territory are entitled to full territorial citizenship upon completion of their service." Daniel stared at the papers, knowing they had to be forgeries, but excellent ones, bearing official seals and signatures that looked authentic. Beside him, Aiyana remained perfectly still, but he could feel her tension like a wire about to snap. "Even if this is legitimate," Crawford said, studying the documents, "it doesn't address the question of this supposed marriage." "Actually, it does." Hayes smiled slightly. "Military contractors are entitled to marry within territorial boundaries, without tribal consent or federal oversight. The marriage is automatically recognized under territorial law." Crawford's face darkened as he realized his authority was being systematically undermined. "This is highly irregular. What's irregular is a federal agent harassing a war hero and her husband without proper justification." Hayes's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I suggest you return to your superiors and inform them that this matter has been resolved through proper military channels." For a long moment, Crawford stared at the papers, clearly looking for some flaw he could exploit. Finally, he thrust them back at Hayes with obvious reluctance. "This isn't over," he said to Daniel. "I'll be watching this situation closely." "You do that," Daniel replied evenly. They watched the federal party ride away, tension thick as smoke, until the last horse disappeared over the ridge. Only then did Daniel turn to Hayes, questions burning in his throat. "Why?" he asked simply. Hayes looked older, then Daniel remembered his hair gone gray at the temples, his face marked by years of making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. "Because I owed you," Hayes said quietly. "Because you saved my life at Apache Pass, and I never got the chance to return the favor." He glanced at Aiyana, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. And because I've seen what happens when good people get caught up in bad politics, too much of that during the war. Those papers will hold up under any reasonable scrutiny. I have friends in Washington who understand the value of flexibility in frontier administration. Hayes remounted his horse. But Crawford wasn't lying about watching you. You'll need to be careful. We will be. Aiyana spoke for the first time since Hayes had arrived. Thank you. Hayes touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. Ma'am, Daniel, try to stay out of trouble. I'll do my best. After Hayes and Jake disappeared into the forest, Daniel and Aiyana stood alone on their porch, the weight of what had almost happened settling over them like evening shadows. We came close, Daniel said finally. Too close. Aiyana leaned against him, her strength finally showing cracks. I thought this was over when we chose each other. I thought love would be enough. Maybe it is. Maybe this was just the mountain testing whether we're serious about staying. Aiyana looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of afternoon. Are we serious about staying? Daniel thought about the question about the life they'd been building in his cabin, about the way she hummed while cooking, and how she never complained, about the isolation that had driven him nearly mad before she arrived. He thought about Sarah and Emma buried on the hill behind the cabin, and how guilt had shaped his existence for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to want something for himself. Yes, he said finally, I'm serious about staying, about building something here that's ours. Even if it means more fights, more men like Crawford coming to test us, especially then, because running away is what I did after the mine collapse. This time I want to stand and fight for what matters. Aiyana smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since the confrontation began. Good, because I'm tired of running too. That night they made love with a desperate intensity that spoke to how close they'd come to losing everything. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Aiyana whispered against his chest, I want to have your child. Daniel's arms tightened around her. The world's dangerous. Children complicate everything. I know, but I want to create something beautiful anyway. Something that proves love can survive in hard places. Daniel kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of sage and pine needles that always seemed to cling to her hair. Then we'll make something beautiful, and we'll protect it with everything we have. Outside, spring rain began to fall, washing the last of winter's snow from the mountain peaks and filling the world with the promise of new growth. Inside the cabin, two people who'd found each other in the wilderness made plans for a future that neither of them had dared to imagine when the storm first brought them together. The mountain had tested them and found them worthy. Now came the harder test, learning to trust happiness when it offered itself without asking for guarantees. The baby came in early October when the aspen trees turned the mountainsides to gold, and the air carried the sharp promise of winter's return. Daniel had ridden to Silverton for the midwife 3 days earlier when Aiyana's pains began, but little Sarah McKenna decided she couldn't wait for professional help. Aiyana delivered their daughter on the same bed where she and Daniel had first come together as husband and wife, with only Daniel's steady hands and whispered encouragements to see her through. When the baby finally emerged, slippery and perfect, and screaming with indignation, Daniel wept openly, for the first time since his wife and daughter had died in the mine collapse 7 years earlier. She's beautiful, he whispered, placing the tiny girl on Aiyana's chest. She's perfect. She has your eyes, Aiyana said, exhausted but radiant. And my stubborn streak, judging by how she fought her way into the world. Daniel touched his daughter's impossibly small fingers, marveling at how completely she gripped his heart with her mere existence. Sarah, her name is Sarah. After your first wife, after hope, Daniel said quietly, after second chances and the courage to love again. They named her Sarah Aiyana McKenna, and from her first breath, she seemed determined to claim her place in their mountain sanctuary. She nursed fiercely, slept deeply, and when she cried, the sound echoed off the peaks like a declaration that new life had taken root in this high, hard country. The cabin changed around their daughter's presence. Daniel built a cradle from pine he'd seasoned for 2 years, carving small birds and flowers into the headboard. Aiyana sewed quilts from Sarah's old dresses, creating warmth from memory. The room that had once felt empty now overflowed with the small necessities of new life. Cloth diapers drying by the fire, tiny gowns that seemed too delicate for the frontier, bottles and blankets, and the sweet, milky scent of an infant well-loved. Winter arrived early that year, sealing them into their valley with walls of snow that reached the cabin's windows. But where previous winters had felt like imprisonment, this one felt like protection. The three of them, four counting, Old Blue the hound dog Daniel had acquired from a passing trader, settled into rhythms that felt ancient and right. Daniel split wood while Aiyana nursed the baby by the fire. Aiyana sang old Apache lullabies while Daniel repaired harness and cleaned his rifle. They took turns walking the floor with Sarah when she was colicky, and on clear nights they stood together on the porch, watching stars wheel overhead, while their daughter slept warm against Aiyana's chest. "She'll grow up knowing she belongs here," Aiyana said one evening as they watched snow fall beyond the lamplight's reach. "She'll never know what it feels like to be cast out or unwanted. She'll know she's loved," Daniel agreed. "That's more than either of us had at her age." Spring brought visitors Jake Morrison with news from the Valley, Colonel Hayes, with updates on Crawford's continued interference in Indian affairs, and eventually the midwife Daniel had summoned too late for Sarah's birth. Mrs. Patterson pronounced the baby healthy and thriving, then stayed for dinner and what turned into an evening of stories and shared memories. "You've built something good here," she told Daniel as she prepared to leave the next morning. "Takes courage to start over after loss like you've known." "Courage had nothing to do with it," Daniel replied, watching Aiyana bounce Sarah on her knee while humming a wordless tune. "I just finally learned the difference between existing and living." Summer brought new challenges and greater joys. Sarah learned to smile, then laugh, then pull herself up to standing while clutching the furniture with fierce determination. She took her first steps between Daniel and Aiyana on a warm August afternoon, toddling 3 unsteady paces before collapsing into her father's arms with a gurgle of triumph. "Our mountain girl," Aiyana said proudly. "Born to this place, raised in this thin air. She'll be stronger than either of us." That autumn on Sarah's first birthday, they climbed the hill behind the cabin where Daniel had buried his first family. The graves were marked now with proper headstones that Daniel had carved during the long winter evenings, and wildflowers grew thick around the mounded earth. "They would have loved her," Daniel said, holding Sarah while she babbled and reached for the dancing leaves. "They would have loved you," Aiyana replied. "Both of you. The men you've become, the father you are now." Daniel knelt and placed a small pine cone on each grave gifts from Sarah, though she was too young to understand the gesture. "I used to think loving again meant forgetting them. Now I know it means honoring what they taught me about what matters." "And what matters?" Daniel looked at his wife and daughter backlit by October sunshine that turned Aiyana's black hair to silk and made Sarah's eyes sparkle with inherited mischief. "Family, home, the courage to keep building even when you've lost everything before." 2 years later, when Sarah had grown into a fearless toddler who climbed everything in reach and chattered constantly in a mixture of English and Apache words, Aiyana delivered their son. Thomas Windwalker McKenna arrived during a late spring snowstorm, as if determined to match his father's dramatic entrance into the family. "Now we have a match set," Daniel said, cradling his son while Sarah peered suspiciously at the competition for attention. "One mountain girl, one mountain boy, and one very tired mountain mother," Aiyana added with exhausted humor, "and one mountain father who never thought he'd deserve this much happiness." By the time Thomas learned to walk, Sarah had taught herself to read using Daniel's collection of books and Aiyana's patient instruction. The little girl moved through their cabin like she owned it, which she did in all the ways that mattered. She helped her mother tend the enlarged garden, followed her father on hunting trips where she learned to track elk and read weather signs, and appointed herself chief protector of her baby brother. "She's going to be troubled," Jake Morrison observed during one of his visits, watching 3-year-old Sarah organize a complex game that involved arranging pine cones in military formations. "Good," Aiyana replied. "The world needs more women who know how to cause the right kind of trouble." Daniel had carved the new room they needed off the main cabin, and Aiyana had furnished it with bright quilts and small furniture Daniel built in the evenings. The cabin that had once sheltered one broken man now housed a family whose laughter echoed off the surrounding peaks and whose love had taken root so deeply that even the harsh mountain winters couldn't shake it loose. On quiet evenings when the children slept and the fire burned low, Daniel and Aiyana would sit together on their porch listening to the night sounds of their mountain owl calls and wolf song and the distant crack of ice shifting in the high places. "Do you ever miss it?" Daniel asked one such evening. "Your tribe, your people's ways." "I teach them to the children," Aiyana replied. "The stories, the songs, the respect for the land that gives us life. My people's ways live on in Sarah and Thomas. That's enough." "And do you ever regret staying, choosing this life over whatever else might have been possible?" Aiyana turned to study his profile in the starlight. Do you regret building something beautiful from the wreckage of what you lost? Never. And then you have your answer. Years passed, like seasons, each one adding new layers to their life together. Sarah grew tall and strong, and opinionated, equally comfortable tracking deer with her father and grinding corn with her mother. Thomas developed his father's quiet strength and his mother's gift for reading the emotions of animals and people with equal skill. Daniel's hair went gray at the temples, and lines appeared around Aiyana's eyes, but their love deepened rather than dimmed. They'd learned to fight fairly, to forgive quickly, and to find humor in the small disasters that marked any long marriage, burned dinners, and sleepless nights in the chaos of raising children in isolation. The mountain that had once been Daniel's refuge from the world became their family's foundation. They added rooms and outbuildings, fenced pastures, and planted orchards, built something permanent from the temporary shelter where a broken man had once hidden from his grief. Crawford never returned, though they heard he'd been reassigned to a desk job in Washington after Colonel Hayes submitted a detailed report on federal overreach in territorial Indian policy. Other officials occasionally made inquiries, but the McKenna family's legal status remained secure, protected by military service records and territorial citizenship papers that grew more legitimate with each passing year. On Sarah's 10th birthday, the family climbed to the highest ridge behind their valley, carrying a picnic lunch and climbing gear Daniel had taught the children to use. From the peak, they could see for hundreds of miles in every direction, a vast landscape of mountains and forests and sky that seemed to stretch toward infinity. This is all ours, Sarah declared with the confidence of a child who'd never known displacement or uncertainty. Not ours, Aiyana corrected gently. Ours to care for. The land doesn't belong to us, we belong to it. Will we always live here? Thomas asked, leaning against his father's leg while studying the view. Daniel looked out over the territory that had given him sanctuary and a second chance at family, thinking of the bullet hole in his door that he'd never bothered to repair because it reminded him where he'd come from and how far he'd traveled. As long as the mountain will have us, he said finally. As long as we remember to be grateful for what we've been given. Instead, it had been salvation disguised as hardship, hope, dressed in the very clothing of the thing he'd feared most, the possibility of loving again and losing again and surviving the loss. Now watching his children race ahead down the familiar trail, while his wife walked beside him in comfortable silence, Daniel understood what Sisika had tried to tell him that first night. The mountain spirits had offered him a gift, and he'd been wise enough or desperate enough to accept it. Behind them, the peaks caught the last light of day, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that would fade into star-filled darkness. Ahead lay their cabin smoke rising from the chimney windows, glowing with warmth and welcome. Home, family, love that had learned to survive in hard places. The bullet hole in the door was still there when they arrived, but Daniel no longer saw it as a monument to failure. Now it looked like what it had always been, a small imperfection in something solid and lasting, a reminder that even damaged things could provide shelter when shelter was needed most. That night, after the children were asleep and the cabin settled into quiet, Daniel and Aiyana lay together in the bed where their love had first taken root and their children had been born. Outside, the wind sang through the pines with a voice that had become as familiar as breathing. No regrets, Aiyana whispered against his chest. Only one, Daniel replied, stroking her hair in the darkness. What, ma'am? What's that? That it took me so long to understand that the best way to honor the dead is to have the courage to keep living. Aiyana's answer was a kiss, soft and sure, and tasting of the life they'd built together in this high, hard country where love had learned to take root in the most unlikely soil and grow strong enough to withstand any storm the mountain chose to send their way. In the morning, there would be chores and children and the thousand small responsibilities of a life fully lived. But tonight, there was only this, the quiet breathing of a family at peace, the steady heartbeat of love that had survived loss and found its way home, and the whispered promise of the wind that some things, the truest and most precious things, were built to last forever.